nothing is more convenient than ordering today and having it delivered tomorrow, as you and I know best, or at least in the next 48 hours. And that's basically the Amazon Prime promise. Amazon has invested tens of billions of dollars into its logistics infrastructure to deliver on that promise. And by now, some 20 years later, Amazon Prime is so much more than just fast and free delivery. It's this vast ecosystem speaking to every customer out there. I mean, if you want to listen to music, it's Amazon Prime. Movies and shows, Amazon Prime. Thursday night football for you, Amazon Prime. Champions League for me, Amazon Prime. More than 230 million members are subscribed to the service. And last year, Prime alone generated about $40 billion in revenues.
Welcome back, folks, to our Intrinsic Value podcast, where we go through the business breakdowns of different companies every week, estimate their intrinsic value, and then decide whether to add them to our portfolio of stock holdings. And before we get started, let me just take a moment to make a quick special announcement. Daniel and I are really excited to announce that we are launching a new community for investors in our audience to join. This will be an exclusive community where basically we vet every member and cap the total size of the community to ensure that it stays meaningful and intimately sized such that everybody can know each other. And for a limited time, we are opening up just 30 spots to the public. And I would say if you're just even remotely interested, you should go ahead and join the waitlist at theinvestorspodcast.com/intrinsic value community. For applicants, if you're admitted, you'll have the chance to network with other like-minded investors, share stock ideas, and get feedback on pitches, dial into calls with expert guest speakers, get the latest updates on Daniel and I's portfolio of investments, and really so much more that we're hoping to offer for people. And I just think it's going to be really, really special. And like I said, if you want to learn more about it and join the wait list for one of those limited spots, just visit theinvestorspodcast.com/intrinsic value community. We'll also have that link in the description below for this episode. So with that, let's get into our episode today on yet another member of the Magnificent Seven. We're always a little hesitant, I would say, when it comes to these kind of companies, and we have covered Alphabet before. It's not like we're working off insider tips. Everyone knows them and knows them pretty well, and they tend to dominate the headlines and just get a lot of attention. But at the same time, at least in my opinion, and probably yours too, Daniel, I think we can safely say these are some of the best businesses ever created in the history of capitalism. And ignoring them would not feel right either, especially if we could get them at what I would call a fair price. So that's why we've made it a rule to only cover these types of company when not only the story is compelling, but also the valuation gives investors a real reason to take a closer look. And we'll see over the course of today's episode, but there's a case for Amazon beginning to reach that point. The stock has been more or less flat for the past 4 years, and recently it's been caught up in the broader market slump, been particularly hit hard by tariff fears and macro uncertainty, but also some of the big announcements that they've made on the CapEx side with investments. So it's starting to raise an interesting possibility where we might be looking at what is, of course, a phenomenal business that's temporarily trading at a much more reasonable price than we normally get because of these factors that are really outside of its control, and also because of these large investments that could potentially create new growth drivers for the next decade to come. And whether that hypothesis holds up and whether Amazon's fundamentals and valuation truly make sense for investors today is exactly what we're trying to figure out. So Daniel, I'll let you take it from here. Walk us through, how does Amazon's business actually work? And is now the right time to get on board?
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. I mean, historically, there have been only very few times when the answer to that question was no. I mean, you just mentioned that Amazon had a couple of rough years, but it's a phenomenal company. And at the same time, it's not yet part of our portfolio. So it really does feel about time that we cover Amazon, just like we covered Google. And it has been a fantastic company and probably also be a very good investment for our portfolio in the time to come. We all have this feeling that we already know those companies, Amazon and Google as well. But one thing that I realize again and again, and you probably feel the same, is that whenever we start researching these companies, there's so much that we don't yet know. For most of us, Amazon is the place that we go to just buy about anything. But under the hood, it's so much more than just an online store. It's a logistic empire, it's a cloud infrastructure giant, a growing advertising platform, and perhaps it will soon also be a space company as well. It's honestly mind-boggling when you just stop and look at your day-to-day life and see how much of it is dependent on Amazon. I mean, my entire recording setup here, like the microphone, the stand, cables, all of that was ordered and delivered by Amazon. It's incredible, the impact that Amazon has on all of our lives. And just last night, when I was prepping some of the final notes for this episode, I had Prime Video on in the background, just watching a show. And earlier today, I just got a notification that the package I was just ordering 24 hours ago is arriving this evening. So it's incredible. And it's just so seamlessly baked into our routines that we forget how many layers of infrastructure are actually behind that simplicity. And that's what makes Amazon so interesting. It's not just an online retailer, it's this operating system for consumption, from logistics and entertainment to data and also cloud computing. We're all part of it, and yet the segments that drive most of the value, things like AWS, and in part also its ad business, are mostly invisible to the average consumer like you and me.
I think it's safe to say you are preaching to the choir, Daniel. I'm embarrassed that I have not dove deeper into Amazon as such a long-time user. So I think Peter Lynch would be very disappointed in me. I'm sure Amazon loves me as a customer though, and it sounds like the same for you. I pay for Prime, but I also have the credit card, probably get at least what feels like a delivery every day, and pretty frequently shop at Whole Foods too. I am deeply integrated into the ecosystem. And I even have that Palm Pay thing set up at, when you're shopping at Whole Foods, you can just scan your palm and it immediately checks you out. And it saves me maybe like 30 seconds, but it's still a cool novelty. And it's funny because I was a shareholder in Whole Foods over a decade ago. And I don't really think it was the best investment ever. I was kind of new to investing at the time, but I was investing in what I understood, and I did understand Whole Foods. And so I got paid in cash when Amazon acquired the business. And all I can say is that in hindsight, I wish I'd been paid in Amazon stock instead of cash. So I really have no excuse for not owning Amazon. I had that opportunity to take that cash and I could have just bought Amazon shares. And I didn't realize at the time what on earth they would do with those Whole Foods stores. It just, you think back to like 2014, 2015, it was like, why are they buying a grocery store? And of course, now we've seen what they've done where they've converted these stores to double as these fulfillment and return centers for Amazon packages, on top of being a great grocery store layered over with the Amazon credit card and the rewards and benefits you get there. And I guess it just wasn't clear to me generally what an incredible company Amazon was becoming. It looked like they were kind of just misallocating capital on random things because they were desperate to keep growth going. And on that point, we often look at companies though through our investor glasses, which makes it obvious now that Amazon is more than just a retailer. But for the average consumer, that's not necessarily what they see. And what's even more surprising is how all of that started with something as simple as selling books online. I think most people know Amazon started in the 90s, but the full story, how it evolved from this niche internet retailer into a global tech platform, is wild in its own right and worth further study. So, Daniel, where does that story begin?
I will never forget when I first heard about Jeff Bezos and that he started working at a McDonald's and then went on to become the wealthiest person on the planet and basically building the biggest e-commerce store in the world. That was many, many years ago, and it was kind of my first contact to Amazon and that entire story. But as compelling as it sounds, it has been somewhat polished to fit the American dream narrative. Yes, Bezos did work for McDonald's, but he was only 16 years old, and it wasn't like his family struggled for money and he had to work to support them. It was a summer job like many of us did as teenagers to make some money on the side. And Bezos was a highly intelligent child, and I would highly recommend listening to Kyle's episode on We Study Billionaires, where he dug a bit deeper into Bezos' childhood, and I'll link to it in the show notes so you can just give it a listen after this show. What matters for us most is understanding him as a CEO. In 1986, he graduated with a degree in electrical engineering and computer science from the prestigious University Princeton. And of course, he had excellent grades and qualifications that also secured him some job offers from companies like Intel or Bell Labs. The later one is not that known anymore, but he chose to work on Wall Street instead. And he was only 30 years when he became senior vice president at D.E. Shaw, which is one of the highest rated hedge funds in the US and basically across the globe.
It sounds like his life could have taken a very different path. Climbing the corporate ladder at some of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street, maybe even leading D.E. Shaw or some other hedge fund one day. And I'm sure he would have been fabulously wealthy. But of course, he went after a more ambitious path and unlocked an unimaginable amount of wealth in doing so.
I think looking back, he definitely made the right decision. Although I wouldn't doubt for a second that Bezos will be an outstanding investor as well. I mean, in some ways, he has been an investor, a very concentrated one, but still, there's this famous conversation that he had together with Buffett, where he basically asked him, your investment approach is so simple, you're one of the richest men in the world, and it's also straightforward. So why don't others just copy you? And then Buffett was answering like, because nobody wants to get rich slowly. And that's certainly not true for Bezos. But if we look at Amazon's history, Bezos' mindset was always fixated on long-term goals. So he never made decisions based on what Wall Street would like to see in the next quarter or even in the next year.
I think many in the audience will remember or have read about the reality that Amazon was considered just another unprofitable internet company by Wall Street for probably close to a decade. And especially in the years after the dot-com bubble burst, there's this stat that Amazon declined by something like 90% in 2001. And it would have been completely unimaginable for anyone to think that it could rise from the ashes in the way that it has. And partly that's because it took Amazon stock 8 years to recover from that crash. And analysts often follow stock prices instead of predicting them. And also because Amazon had this playbook where they deliberately kept their net income low or even negative, and that made them look less profitable than they actually were. And that all added together to make Amazon this hidden gem that most people didn't appreciate.
They did that for over 2 decades. It was only in about 2015 that Amazon started consistently reporting stable and growing earnings. Well, Wall Street didn't understand the strategy and pretty much punished Amazon for not showing profits. Bezos was always looking 10 years ahead. As long as Amazon could afford it, he preferred investing into the business, creating long-term value by capturing market share, building durable infrastructure, and not optimizing for the next quarter's earnings report. And honestly, also not giving back any cash to shareholders. Every dollar of operating income was seen as a resource to build new logistics centers, enter new markets and verticals, or develop new businesses like Prime, Kindle, Alexa, or AWS. And of course, improve customer experience, faster shipping, lower prices, just getting this Amazon flywheel going.
We talk about flywheels a lot. We've done so in discussing Disney, Nintendo, and Airbnb. And I think the concept of the flywheel originates with Disney. And it's now Amazon is kind of the prototype for using that flywheel to excellence. And I think even with Airbnb, though, if I would try to explain what their flywheel is, but how about you walk us through Amazon's flywheel? And there's probably a lot more moving parts than with Airbnb.
Well, part of a flywheel is to keep it simple. And we often use that term, and I know it's kind of overused at this point, but we mostly discuss quality companies. And a quality company has a flywheel. Otherwise, it just wouldn't reach that level of quality. And in Amazon's case, everything is basically centered around customer experience. That's at the core of what Amazon stands for. Buffett once said there's no one as good as Bezos in understanding what customers want and figuring out how to deliver that. And what they want, at least I would say that, is actually the easier part. They want low prices and high convenience. The difficult part is figuring out how to make that happen. And that's where Amazon Prime comes into play. Nothing is more convenient than ordering today and having it delivered tomorrow, as you and I know best, or at least in the next 48 hours. And that's basically the Amazon Prime promise. Amazon has invested tens of billions of dollars into its logistics infrastructure to deliver on that promise. And by now, some 20 years later, Amazon Prime is so much more than just fast and free delivery. It's this vast ecosystem speaking to every customer out there. If you want to listen to music, it's Amazon Prime. Movies and shows, Amazon Prime. Thursday night football for you, Amazon Prime. Champions League for me, Amazon Prime. More than 230 million members are subscribed to the service. And last year, Prime alone generated about $40 billion in revenues. But Prime is not just important as profit or revenue driver. While Amazon doesn't report margins for Prime, they're probably not as high as one would intuitively think, just because if you consider the massive spend on content for Prime Video, and even longer term, all these infrastructure investments, if you fully allocate all these costs to Prime and basically the Prime package, they drag down the profitability of that segment. But that's not a risk or a huge problem because Prime is just one part of the flywheel that we're mentioning here. It supports the retail business, the advertising business, and it plays a huge part in retaining customers for Amazon. I mean, Prime members spend twice as much as non-Prime shoppers, around $1,200 per year. They also buy more often. And when they browse through Amazon, they're 70% more likely to actually go through with the purchasing process. And with over 90% of them renewing their membership every single year, people just seem to love their Prime membership. And honestly, I get it. I mean, my Prime membership would be one of the last subscriptions that I would cancel. And that's despite me not being much of an online shopper. I think the average subscriber benefits a lot more than I do from this subscription. Prime is just another testament to Bezos' long-term vision. He was convinced that the value proposition of free and fast delivery would justify billion, if not tens of billions of dollar investments. And that's basically without any data that would show him that this would actually pay off.
It's really interesting because when I think about my own experience with Prime, I think the inertia for me to overcome to make an order has just fallen over time, such that now there's almost no barrier to me making a purchase. If it's a small ticket item, in just 2 seconds, I'm like, oh, I need that, click, got it. Whereas even like 5 or 6 years ago, I'd be like, oh, do I really need this? And I'll add it to my cart and I'll think about it and maybe I don't need it. And so that is kind of an anecdotal testament to just how building trust in that brand and that ecosystem and knowing you're going to get things when you expect to and that it's going to work well, of how powerful that is. And on the one hand, when I think about that $1,200 a year stat, it sounds really substantial. And then yet again, when I think about my own spending on Amazon, as I just alluded to, it's probably about twice that and really a lot higher if you also factor in groceries at Whole Foods. So I get it. The service more than pays for itself, in my opinion. The free shipping is worth well more than whatever the price of the membership is. I don't even know. Is it like $140 a year? And then this is going to sound like an ad for Amazon, which it's not. But with the Amazon card, I also get 5% cash back on every Amazon and Whole Foods transaction. So if you're spending $2,000 a year across Amazon, that adds up. And I'm sure the average annual spending too, for those who are Prime members that also have the Amazon credit card, I would guess that's a lot higher than the $1,200 they say on average for just Prime members.
They don't share any data on that, but I would be almost certainly sure that's the case. And speaking of Amazon's entire ecosystem, there's a whole side of the business, but that's pretty visible. It's just not recognized, and it's a huge business. It's Amazon's advertising business. While most people think of Amazon, they just think of it like buying stuff and maybe even go to Whole Foods in your case. But Amazon today is also one of the largest digital ad platforms in the world, just right behind Google and Meta. I think it even surpassed YouTube a couple of years ago and is now making $20 billion more in revenue than YouTube. Every time that you search on Amazon for just about anything, you will see these top listings, and a lot of them are so-called sponsored posts. And they are basically just paid ads. And that ad business brought in over $55 billion in revenue last year, and it's incredibly high margin. Because Amazon doesn't have to make anything, store anything, or ship anything to earn those dollars. They just sell placement to brands. And the good news for Amazon is that it's growing faster than the lower margin core business, so the retail operations. And coming back to Amazon's Flywheel, this is just another great example of a business or a business unit playing its part in the entire ecosystem. While Uber's, Reddit's, and even Meta's or Google's ad business is highly profitable, only for Amazon, it's another self-reinforcing loop. Advertising brands pay Amazon to show up first, then customers find products faster, sales increase, and more brands are incentivized to advertise again. And Amazon earns on both sides of that trade. And neither customers nor merchants ever leave the Amazon platform in this entire sales cycle.
Hey guys, this is your host of the Intrinsic Value Podcast, Shawn O'Malley. Just like everybody else, there was a time when I was a beginner investor, and I have to say, investing is particularly filled with jargon that can just make it so difficult for new investors to understand what is going on. But it's never too late to get smarter about stock investing from the ground up. At the Investors Podcast Network, we've made a habit of studying the world's best investors, and now I'm distilling those learnings into a simple course for you or for anyone in your life who you might want to share the gift of knowledge with. With my How to Get Started with Stocks course, you can master the principles of excellent lifelong investing with valuable insights for both beginners and pros. The course covers 10 different sections, beginning with the basics of what a stock actually is and how the stock markets work, to strategies to optimize your retirement savings, how to pick great companies for the long term, what to look for in ETFs, and how to monitor your investments, plus so much more. To begin getting smarter about investing, just visit theinvestorspodcast.com/get started with stocks. That's theinvestorspodcast.com/get started with stocks. And for a limited time, you can use code STOCKS15 for a 15% discount at checkout. Want to land a job in investment banking or private equity, but feel like you're stuck on the outside looking in? That's where CFI, the Corporate Finance Institute, comes in. CFI is the #1 rated online finance and banking training provider, chosen by over 2 million professionals worldwide. CFI's courses equip you with the same skills top analysts and associates use at leading firms. I really appreciate that you can study at your own pace and have the chance to solve real-world problems with case studies. It gets even better though. Right now you can get 30% off any Corporate Finance Institute plan. Take the first step toward your dream job. Head to corporatefinanceinstitute.com, enroll today, and use code INVESTORS30 at checkout for 30% off. I just got back from traveling to Austin for a wedding for one of my best friends from high school. What a cool city it is too. I even had a chance to ride in a self-driving taxi. That's the great thing about travel, the chance to make lifelong memories. While I was out of town though, I couldn't help but think about how my house back at home was totally unused, burning cash, as it always is whenever I travel, and I travel a lot. Fortunately, that doesn't have to be the case anymore though. Using your house as an Airbnb is now easier than ever. With a co-host, someone else can do all the hosting for you on Airbnb. My wife and I got married in December, but are currently saving up for our honeymoon trip still, and also trying to work to buy a new home at the same time. So anything that puts a couple of extra dollars in the bank account helps a ton right now. Next time I'm traveling and making memories, maybe with my wife on our honeymoon, I think it's cool to know that with a co-host, I'll be helping someone else do the same thing in my home without the stress. If you have a second home, travel often, or are away for extended periods of time, go find a co-host at airbnb.com/host and start earning extra money today. I've certainly referenced Amazon's ability to convert its large platform and all that user data into what has now become a massive advertising marketplace. As part of my investment thesis is on these other companies like Uber and Reddit that also have a lot of under-monetized advertising real estate, but also have very wide scale and a lot of data and the potential to serve valuable ads to their users. So seeing what Amazon has been able to do in advertising has really shaped my mental model of some of these other tech investments that we've looked at. And there's no doubt about it, right? Amazon is the inspiration. And one thing that really stands out to me whenever I visit Amazon is just how dependent merchants have become on running ads, and not always by choice. It's not just a nice to have marketing tool anymore in the way that maybe it was when it first started. In many categories, the top search results are almost entirely paid placements. And if you're not a market leader in a certain niche and you're not running ads, your products are going to be buried on page 2 or 3, and they might as well be dead. They might as well not even be there. No one's going to see them, and there's no clicks. And so that just strikes me as a big shift from what Amazon used to be. where it was kind of a merit-based marketplace where you'd have the customer reviews and sales performance that were actually the real drivers of visibility. It was a meritocracy. And now it feels more of a pay-to-play system, which is a better business for Amazon, of course. But for those smaller merchants, those ad costs can really eat into margins. And maybe there's another conversation there of it's a bad place to list your products. Ultimately, you have less supply and how that affects Amazon in the long term. But between these fulfillment fees, referral fees, and advertising, some sellers say that Amazon takes over 30% of the revenue. And so like I was just saying, that might not be sustainable long term, or at least that would be my concern as kind of an outsider looking at Amazon. And last week, as we talked about in our Shopify episode, Shopify is not necessarily a direct competitor, but it does give merchants an escape route. If you're frustrated with being a commoditized product on Amazon in some ways, and also in giving Amazon these big fees, Shopify lets you build your own storefront, own your customer relationship, and just control the brand experience. It's a very different game, but for some, a more sustainable one long term.
It's a tough spot for merchants on Amazon. When we discussed Shopify, I kind of gave you the bearish arguments and arguing against Shopify and the strength for Amazon. You can say the same the other way around, like discussing how much power Amazon actually has over merchants just has to introduce some regulatory burdens along the way. I mean, on the one hand, Amazon gives them instant access to millions of customers. But on the other, they're increasingly paying for that privilege, and it chips away at their margins. But it's also what makes Amazon's model so powerful. Every part of the flywheel feeds into another, whether it's logistics, advertising, or subscriptions. And as long as Amazon remains the only platform that can offer merchants about 300 million active customers, and I think that will be the case for quite some time, at least in their target markets, I really don't see merchants leaving the platform.
And while we've talked a lot about Amazon's retail engine and the pressure facing merchants, there's this whole other side of the business that most consumers, as we've talked about, really don't even necessarily notice. And it's arguably Amazon's most important profit driver. It's actually the same with our portfolio company Alphabet too. And of course, I'm talking about the cloud division. So with Amazon, that's referred to as AWS, or just Amazon Web Services. But again, this is the company's cloud computing business. And it powers everything from Netflix to NASA. And unless you're a really technically minded person, it's hard to explain exactly what that unit does.
Yes, AWS is even further disconnected from the average customer. Ads are a business that we can all still understand. And when we see a sponsored post, we know, at least to some extent, that we are now part of this business model. AWS has seemingly no connection to the average Amazon customer at all. But it's the backbone of much of the modern internet. It's the cloud infrastructure that powers Netflix, Airbnb, and as you said, even NASA. And well, parts of Amazon itself are also powered by AWS. And while it only accounts for a bit less than 20% of Amazon's total revenue, it contributes more than half of the company's total operating income. I feel like this is not a secret anymore among the investor community, but I keep being amazed at how many people from the outside don't even know about this business and definitely not about its importance. The business we all know, selling physical goods, often leaves Amazon with margins in the low single digits, and AWS runs at operating margins in the 30s. Especially in recent quarters and years, it has made significant improvements on that front, and this last quarter, so Q1 of 2025, it actually reached 40% margins, its highest ever. In fact, when you look at this chart now on your screens of revenues and profits, you can see just how slim margins are for Amazon's e-commerce business. And the international business is even worse off. It has actually been loss-making in 3 out of the last 5 years. It is profitable now and the trend is positive, but AWS and its importance is just not to underestimate.
The thing about Amazon is that it's just such a tough business in the e-commerce world to be in. And that's exactly what analysts feared back in the early and mid 2000s when folks were really bearish on it. But at the same time, they've been so operationally excellent that they've built this untouchable logistics backbone and then use that to propel themselves into more attractive businesses like high margin advertising and paid subscriptions with Prime, and more recently, cloud computing, as you just discussed. So when we look back and think about why Amazon's success, which seems so inevitable now, was hard to spot, I think it's partly because early Amazon deliberately not only kept those profits down, but also because that core e-commerce business itself simply wasn't that profitable. There actually wasn't as much to hide as you'd think. And it really couldn't be unless you could imagine all of these other innovative ways that they would reinvent themselves over the years.
That's why expanding its business has been so important for Amazon. And that's also why Bezos knew they have to reinvest and basically reinvent the company each year, because the core business is not that great. And at the same time, without the scale in the e-commerce business, it couldn't have built the entire Prime ecosystem, the advertising business, and especially AWS. There have been more than just one or two instances where Amazon used its retail business and its quote-unquote ability to make losses to basically crush competitors. Other retailers need to turn a profit since they have no AWS or ads business that subsidizes its main business.
And to get back to AWS again, could you just explain what AWS is in the simplest layman terms possible? As you said, I think most people are probably not as familiar with it as they'd like to be.
So basically, AWS is like a utility company for computing. It gives businesses the digital infrastructure that they need to operate, but without having to build or manage it themselves. Let's take Netflix as an example. Netflix doesn't own giant server farms around the world. Instead, it relies heavily on AWS to store, process, and deliver its vast library of movies and TV shows. So every video you stream, whether it's Stranger Things or The Crown, it's stored securely on AWS servers spread across different regions across the world. And if millions of people would start watching a new show at once, which is what happens when there's a new big release, Netflix doesn't have to worry about servers crashing down. AWS automatically scales up computing resources on demand. And that way they handle spikes in traffic without Netflix needing to physically add any new hardware to their company and system. Amazon's scale helps as well because AWS has data centers all across the world. And this allows Netflix to stream content closer to where the end user or the viewer is. And that improves video quality and speeds, and it also increases upload time.
I think there was that instance where server demand did not scale as well as it was supposed to when there was that Jake Paul and Mike Tyson fight. I think a bunch of people had it blacked out, but generally it works pretty well, point taken. And on that point, how about you paint just a little more color around AWS, but actually maybe from the business perspective, how it makes money and how it is importantly differentiated from some of its competitors, like our portfolio company's product, Google Cloud.
It's often called pay-as-you-go. So customers are not charged any quick monthly fee or any fixed fees for that matter. Instead, they are just billed based on how much computing power they need or they consume. And then beyond that, prices can differ depending on factors like region, speed, or the frequency of access to your files. And then also for backups. So some companies need more backups than others, and that's all stuff you have to pay for. Generally, the faster the data needs to be accessed, the more expensive it becomes, and the higher Amazon's margins are. AWS is the most mature cloud provider. That's basically what differentiates it from Google or from Microsoft. And because it's so mature, it has the highest margin and the highest market share. But Google and Microsoft, with its Azure cloud, have gained significant share in the last decade.
It's fascinating how quickly the cloud market went from being a fragmented market dominated by Amazon to a real heavyweight battle where Amazon, Google, and Microsoft all make up over 60% of the market.
Absolutely. I mean, Microsoft was able to gain momentum because of how deeply embedded in the entire enterprise world they are. And Google, while still smaller, is gaining ground with strength in data, AI, and their open source tools. But getting to the differences, while I'm no cloud expert, AWS posts the highest margins right now, and then Google's margins are not even half of Amazon's. And To me, that just assumes that it's about the scale these companies have or not yet have. You can see that Google's numbers catch up quickly, both in market share and margins. And what's interesting to see is that despite Microsoft and Google are growing market share fast, AWS's market share hasn't changed for a couple of years now. It just continued to grow in line with the market. And despite the growth, Google and Microsoft don't seem to get any customers from AWS. They just onboard new customers when they keep growing. And as you mentioned, Azure has strong relationships with big enterprise customers because Microsoft was already entrenched into the corporate IT with its Office products and Windows servers. They've just bundled their cloud offering into a lot of those broader corporate deals. And all three, Google, Microsoft, and AWS, have customers that you and I know quite well. It's Airbnb, for example, for AWS. It's Daimler for Microsoft's Azure, and Nintendo for Google.
These big tech companies dominate the world, but they also have these interdependencies that I find really interesting that you just touched on. One of our portfolio companies, Airbnb, relies on Amazon for cloud computing support. So Amazon and Google too have found ways to, I guess, make themselves critical services for this lower tier of still very powerful tech companies like Airbnb and Nintendo that don't quite dominate the world in the way that Alphabet and Amazon do. And really any type of company, I guess. And in 2025, probably almost every listed company has some amount of demand for cloud computing. Do you know why customers, once they decide to go with AWS, tend to stick with them? What makes it so sticky?
I think it's not just AWS, it's also for Google and Microsoft. And the short answer would be switching costs. AWS offers different storage classes. At first, a company might just decide to store a bunch of files using the standard high-speed option. But as the companies grow bigger and more cost-conscious, they might decide to move old files into cheaper so-called archive tiers. And that saves them money, but it also builds and adds complexity. And so over time, companies end up spreading their data across different AWS services and storage classes, each with their own pricing, retrieval times, backup setups, and all of those details. And once all of your critical business data is tied into AWS's ecosystem, it's not just expensive to leave, there's also this huge logistical burden of getting all your data from AWS and onboarded to any new cloud provider. And this is what they call vendor lock-in in the industry. And as investors, we probably like to use the term switching costs more than that. And Azure, by contrast, is deeply integrated into Microsoft's broader products like Office, Teams, and Dynamics. And those services already have their own switching costs. And if you just add Azure to that, it's even harder to leave. And for Google Cloud, which, as I said, is the newest of those three, and it just turned profitable not too long ago, it's more focused on AI and data tools. And that's why it doesn't yet have the same scale or vendor lock-in, but it's likely just a matter of time. I mean, if we wouldn't think that, we probably wouldn't own the company as well. AWS just seems like the most mature player, and I expect it to be somewhat of a blueprint for Microsoft and Google in terms of size, but also margin for their cloud businesses going forward.
And I should say, part of our thesis on investing in Google is betting that their cloud business will achieve scale in similar rates of profitability as AWS has. But why don't we switch over to the e-commerce side of things? There are similar, although less direct competitor dynamics for us to consider here. Amazon still dominates US online retail with around 40% market share, but unlike in the early 2000s, especially globally, there is a growing list of challengers. And in Southeast Asia, you have Shopee and Lazada that are building these massive marketplaces, and Kuiper is doing the same in Korea, which was actually one of the first companies we ever covered on this show. And in Latin America, you've got Mercado Libre that has carved out an empire that actually rivals Amazon's own operations in that part of the world. And in India, you've got local giants like Flipkart and reliance that are scaling really fast and are actually also supported by the governments there, which can make them very difficult to compete with. And we've seen in India and China that they sometimes use the same playbook in payments as you highlighted in your Visa episode, where there's a certain amount of government support for those companies. And even in the US, again, just to go through the whole list of competitors, you got players like Walmart and Target that have really stepped up their digital e-commerce game. And Walmart in particular, I would say, has become a pretty serious competitor in groceries and same-day delivery.
And especially the more national competition like Walmart plays a pretty significant role for Amazon, because Amazon is known as this global retailer, at least in my perception, but almost 70% of its business comes from the US. And some weeks ago, you actually asked me whether Amazon is even a big thing here in Germany. And while it is, Germany is actually Amazon's second biggest market, if I'm not mistaken. Apart from the US, Germany, the UK, and Japan, Amazon is relatively underrepresented in the rest of the world.
How do you see the international competition and the criticism of Amazon in regards to their high take rates and the need to advertise and whether that's sustainable?
Amazon's take rate, which is basically the cut that it takes from each third-party transaction, is pretty high if you compare it to their competitors internationally and even nationally. I mean, take Shopify, which only takes a low single-digit percentage, or Alibaba, which also only takes 3 to 5%, although on a much larger base. If you would combine Taobao and Tmall, it's almost double the size of Amazon. And Mercado Libre or Coupang have higher take rates as well, but still well below Amazon's 30 or 40%. And what drives these differences is how integrated each platform is. I mean, Amazon's vertically stacked model, handling fulfillment, shipping, customer service, and also their ads, is just unmatched by any other platform, at least to the extent that Amazon is doing it. That level of control just gives it so much pricing power. It also creates friction, as you mentioned. So while its take rate is high, and that's a pretty good thing for their margins right now, it comes with trade-offs around seller satisfaction and also, perhaps in the future, and we've also seen it in the past, regulatory scrutiny. But as I mentioned in our Shopify episode, I don't see that materially impacting Amazon's business, at least anytime soon, because as long as Amazon is the only platform that can deliver a network of 300 million customers to merchants, they have no choice but to sell on Amazon. And many businesses like how easy it is to sell their products on Amazon. I mean, they take care of everything. We even discussed in the Shopify episode this Buy with Prime initiative, which is Amazon's new initiative that allows merchants who do not sell on Amazon to just add an option, which is basically a Prime-like benefit. So you get the fast and the free shipping of Amazon and also their return policy without actually needing to be on the Amazon e-commerce side. That's a huge thing and probably more of a problem for Shopify than Shopify could ever be for Amazon.
What really stands out to me coming out of that whole discussion around take rates and platform integration is that it's just how far Amazon is willing to go to own every layer of the customer experience. It's not just about running a marketplace or offering cloud services. They want to control the infrastructure, the logistics, the ad rails, and even the device that you interact with. And that mindset shows up in places people don't always think about, right? Like take the Alexa division on all the Echo devices. That's not just a side project or an attempt to make some money on hardware. It's part of the same vertical playbook, I would argue. And just like Amazon built its own logistics network to reduce shopping friction or created AWS to power its digital backbone, it invested in voice and hardware to be the front door to your home. And some of those bets have clearly worked with Prime, AWS, and the ad business, and some have not worked out that great. And for example, the physical stores, they probably aren't moving the needle that much. But for now, if we just focus on Amazon's device segment, which feels like one of those areas where maybe the outcome is still unclear of whether it's working or what will work. There are reports out there that I've seen that Alexa has lost billions, and yet Amazon keeps pouring resources into the team that works on it. And Personally, I am not super impressed by the product either after having owned an Alexa for a year and then just basically getting rid of it. So the question becomes, is this just another long-term infrastructure play, or is it a bet that's actually gone too far and is losing the money and now they can't get away from it?
The device strategy is a perfect example of how Bezos and now also Jesse think in decades, not in quarters. But at least up to this point, it's also showing that not every bet that Amazon places actually pays off the way they would immediately or initially think. And at a high level, the Alexa division was never about selling the actual hardware. The idea was that voice could become how people navigate their homes, how they would shop in the future, consume media, and control smart devices. And if that happened, Amazon wanted to be at the center of it. It's kind of like Meta and their metaverse, where they had huge CapEx into something that didn't work out in the end, but they would have been at the forefront if it did. So they treated it like that infrastructure. Echo devices were priced near cost, sometimes even below cost. And the goal was not to profit on that. It was embedding Alexa into people's daily routines. And in theory, once you control the interface, you can drive more Prime engagement, more purchases, and you keep people inside the Amazon ecosystem. And all of that sounds great on paper, but the monetization has really lagged. And for years, Alexa was mostly used to check the weather or setting timers. And that's not exactly the high value interaction that Amazon was hoping for. And Alexa is a bit too expensive for Amazon to be just a high-tech alarm. And you mentioned it. It was losing upwards of $5 billion a year at one point, and it's still losing billions. And a lot of those early ambitions, like building a voice shopping empire, just haven't yet materialized. I mean, to be fair, Alexa is still one of the most widely used voice assistants out there, and Amazon has a footprint in millions of households. And just in February, Amazon announced Alexa Plus, which is basically Alexa 2.0, and it's now, of course, powered by AI features. And since it's not yet widely available, I haven't yet tried it. I would just assume it's a lot better than the original Alexa. It's basically like chatting with ChatGPT, so you can talk to it, and of course, you link it to all the possible Amazon devices, like its Ring cameras, TVs, and all sorts of smart house appliances. So the Alexa story is, at least I would say that, at an inflection point. It still fits Amazon's long-term DNA to build the rails now and figure out monetization later. But Amazon is hitting that later point now. And I think we will see pressure to either scale it back or for the vision to finally prove that it adds measurable value to the broader ecosystem.
I'll be really curious to see how that pans out for them. And I hope to be proven wrong, but after buying one and being really excited about having a robot run my life with voice command, I just quickly felt that the technology, and this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, did not live up to the promises. I actually kind of felt like the products, especially as they aged, they didn't age well. And I almost thought it was embarrassingly bad for a company of Amazon's stature to put out a product like that. But again, that was just my individual experience with it. So take that with a grain of salt. Speaking, though, about the losses of this device segment, maybe we could talk more about capital allocation at Amazon. And I know that's always been a key topic there, and where they had these long periods of no profits and huge investments throughout their different verticals. And in COVID, their investments really started to take off in another way. Between 2020 and 2022, I think Amazon spent over $160 billion in CapEx, just from what I'm seeing now on FinChat when I pull it up. And that went toward nearly tripling its fulfillment and data center footprint. And at the time, it made sense. Our demand was surging, especially during the pandemic, and Amazon doubled down to meet it. But when growth slowed in 2022, there was kind of a more visible financial strain from all of that capital investment. And free cash flow turned to negative $17 billion for the first time in over a decade. And Amazon just had to answer some really tough questions about their capital discipline. So I'd be curious to hear more about how you think about that.
It was also the first time in a while that Amazon stock significantly underperformed due to all these concerns about capital allocation. That used to be a thing of the past since Amazon started to be this cash flow machine. It became in the late 2010s, or at least people knew they have the potential to have a lot of free cash flow if they wanted to. It helps to think about Amazon's capital expenses in two phases in the last 5 years. So during the pandemic, Amazon saw this massive surge in e-commerce demand and then naturally went all in doing investments in physical infrastructure. A huge chunk of the $160 billion went into building new warehouses, expanding delivery stations, and improving last mile logistics. We saw a bit of the same misconception maybe that we've also seen with Nike. It's not as bad as with Amazon since their investments pay off in the long run. But just as Nike, I think Amazon thought that this surge in online sales would just be stickier after the lockdowns. But there was a drawback, and that's why Andy Jassy, the CEO who followed Bezos, first scaled back CapEx in 2023. But he only did so briefly because in the last 2 years, Amazon spent even more money than in the pandemic, over $80 billion just in 2024 alone, and will be even more this year. The second phase, though, is not about logistic investments. AWS and AI are the main objectives this time. And that means data centers and a ton of GPUs, of course, and Amazon, Meta, Google, and Microsoft alone intend to invest more than $300 billion in AI technology just this year in 2025. Add to that the AWS investments, and you can see how this year might be the first ever in which Amazon will actually exceed $100 billion in CapEx. And I thought about the spend of some countries, and $100 billion is more than many countries invest in their infrastructure in any given year.
And it's not Amazon, as you said, right? Among these Mag 7 companies, a lot of them are spending massively on CapEx, which maybe only the exception being Apple.
Yeah, I think Apple is still more device focused, which is just a different business. I mean, the good thing about this phase of investments compared to the COVID investments is that AWS and AI are high margin businesses for Amazon. So the logistic investments benefited Amazon's entire ecosystem, but the business itself wasn't as profitable and still is not as profitable, and the e-commerce business even less so. AWS, on the other hand, has generated more than half of Amazon's operating income, and it's still growing fast. So the investments we see today should yield some high returns in the future. And Amazon's CEO, Andy Jassy, seems highly convinced of this opportunity. After all the AI advancement, he said that, quote, "We thought AWS has a chance to ultimately be a multi-$100 billion revenue run rate business. We now think it could be even larger." So to me personally, that sounds like he is talking trillions of dollars. And that's part of why every big tech company, as you said, perhaps with the exception of Apple, not only in the US, but internationally, comes up with their own AI models. And to me, it seems like many of them are about equally good. And that's kind of what the data suggests too, which could mean that sooner or later, the space will just be commoditized, significantly reducing the returns each company will earn on their investments. And at the same time, the downside of being the only player not to actively invest in the space right now is probably just much larger.
I did want to ask you what you think about the rumors that emerged when DeepSeek was revealed and the allegedly very low investments of these Chinese companies that still led to such a powerful model being developed. And we might all remember that this sent NVIDIA stock tanking a few months ago and raised these bigger questions around why hundreds of billions of dollars needed to be spent by these big tech companies if there were firms in China that were apparently using a fraction of the compute.
That was quite some news a couple of months ago. I mean, supposedly DeepSeek only cost a couple of million to train the model. And while this was a good headline and it definitely brought even more attention to the DeepSeek model, I think those claims were challenged pretty quickly. And since China wasn't allowed to buy NVIDIA chips, they had to come up with a story that would mean they didn't have access to those new chips, and thus they allegedly used older ones that were naturally also much cheaper. We often say, do not look at what people say, just look at what they do. And Alibaba, one of China's biggest players in the AI market, just announced a $50 billion investment into the space. And if they could do it much cheaper, I guess they would. Although, to be fair, those investments will be spread over 3 years. So if you just average it out, it's a lot less than Amazon, Google, or Microsoft are spending, but the output will likely also not be the same.
And whether it was as cheap for DeepSeek to produce their model as they claim, we do know that it was unequivocally a huge advancement that immediately challenged what could be accomplished in AI modeling relative to the inputs. It does seem like most people agree that a major step forward was made in some way. But to just quickly come back to Amazon's AI models, while I know about Google and Meta and Microsoft's models, I don't have a name in mind. I think of Gemini and Copilot, but for Amazon, there's not a name that comes to mind. So what even is their flagship large language model?
Amazon's approach is just very different from all the other big tech companies. Amazon's AI strategy is structured around 3 core layers, and that's the infrastructure layer, the model layer, and then the application layer. At the infrastructure layer, Amazon is building out massive data center capacity and designing its own AI chips to reduce reliance on companies like NVIDIA and also lower computing costs. And the main model that they have is called the Trainium. In the model layer, Amazon offers both proprietary models like the Titan, which is their text and embeddings model, and then Nova, which is a multi-model, and there are certain types of it. It's kind of like a family of models. And also third-party models via its Bedrock platform. So all the large language models that you probably know by name, they are also offered by Amazon. So those could include Claude, which is the AI model from Anthropic. And Amazon's actually invested into that company. I think they have a $4 billion investment made into Anthropic. But they also offer Meta's AI model Llama and many others. And then the third layer, which is the application layer, is where Amazon uses AI within the company and its own ecosystem to improve its business. So Jesse talked about one of those applications, which is Rufus. It's basically an AI-powered shopping assistant. So the long-term vision is to be able to offer everything that today only an actual human shopping assistant could do at a physical store. And what's interesting about this layered approach is that it may help Amazon to sidestep this commoditization risk that we've discussed earlier, because instead of betting everything on building the best model, Amazon is basically positioning itself as the most integrated, cost-effective deployment platform. And that integrates perfectly into what they do with AWS as well.
I don't think I'm saying anything new here, but it is going to be fascinating to see how these different companies end up implementing and monetizing their AI models. And to pivot a little bit, as we're talking about the future, another thing I wanted to ask you about that I alluded to before is Project Kuiper. And Kuiper is Amazon's answer to SpaceX's Starlink. And I think most people don't even know about. I didn't know about it until like 3 weeks ago. And it's a massive undertaking to build what you would call these low Earth orbit satellite, and do so and basically build a network of them that delivers broadband internet to underserved areas around the world. And like I said, it's just a big bet that has kind of gone under the radar because I think SpaceX gets all the attention, and yet Amazon has committed billions to it and plans to launch more than 3,200 satellites over the next few years. And they've already made some progress on that front too. The first 2 prototype satellites were launched successfully in late 2023, and just recently in April 2025, they launched their first 27 production satellites, apparently. And I think it took Amazon probably a little bit longer than they planned, which is why the hype around this initiative has maybe been a bit more quiet in recent years. And yet with the launch of the satellites this year, it does seem like momentum is gaining again.
I haven't heard of this initiative or project before I started my research as well. And I think that's partly because, as you said, it just took all a bit longer than they initially planned. And I wasn't even sure to include it today, since the project is still far from what was supposed to be at this point. But since the both of us talked about it while I did my research, and it's also just such a big opportunity, it wouldn't feel right not mentioning it today. And in theory, this seems like such a no-brainer for Amazon to go after. I mean, Kuiper fits so well into Amazon's larger ecosystem. Few of any other companies benefit as much as Amazon would if more people access the internet. And few other companies have the resources that Amazon does to invest it into such a moonshot, basically. And Jeff Bezos' fascination with space is no secret either. Apparently, he talked about colonizing Mars in his graduation speech in high school. So it's safe to say there were signs for Amazon going this route. And Kuiper is not just about the business of bringing broadband to remote places in the US or parts of Africa or wherever in the world. It's about the bigger picture. So creating the foundation for hundreds of millions of people to access Amazon's ecosystem, shop on Amazon's marketplace, become a Prime member, and bring local companies and governments to the cloud. But sending satellites to space is easier said than done. Amazon initially planned to begin satellite deployment in 2022, but the first two prototype satellites didn't reach orbit until late 2023. And as you said, just a couple of weeks ago, they finally sent the first batch of 27 production satellites into orbit. These delays are a problem for two reasons. The first one is that Elon Musk's Starlink already has 5,000 satellites in space, which gives them a huge head start. And second, Amazon is on a tight schedule. They signed a license requirement deal that allows them to send half of the planned 3,200 satellites into space, but only until July 2026, and the other half until 2029. If they only manage to send, let's say, 500 satellites till then, that's basically it. You cannot send more into space.
Seems like the clock is ticking. I know Bezos only serves as an executive chairman nowadays, so his influence is, at least in theory, rather limited, but I would guess as the founder of Blue Origin, that is something Amazon should be able to leverage in regard to Project Kuiper.
Absolutely. And Amazon is making use of that. They have secured more than 80 rocket launches to make sure they can send up enough satellites in the remaining time. And besides two or three other organizations, Blue Origin is, in fact, one of those partners. We have somewhat of an expert on this topic in our Intrinsic Value community. So perhaps we should ask him about any developments on this.
Yeah, I totally agree, Daniel. And already we've kind of hand selected a few members to form the foundation of the early community before we started opening it up to the public, which we're now doing. But we already have such an incredibly diverse range of investors in it that we can tap into this more decentralized knowledge where everybody can share their circle of competence. So we literally have rocket scientists. We also have venture capitalists and real estate investors and just classic value investors and people focused on pharmaceuticals and biotech. And so, I mean, it's just a really wide range of expertises that people bring. And it's so valuable because when you and I are working on these episodes and we're trying to better understand companies, we can tap into what other people know. And that is really the point of the community, that anyone who joins, that's what they're able to do and get out of it.
Sometimes I'm not even sure if I could get all this research together if I don't have people out of the community giving me their insights when they are such experts. But to pull a thread on Kuiper, if it would work out, Amazon could open the door to hundreds of millions of customers, more merchants, and also governments. And there's potential overlap with pretty much every part of Amazon's broader ecosystem. The risk is investing tens of billions of dollars and never actually making it happen. So Starlink already has, as I said, 5,000 satellites in orbit and millions of users. And Amazon is running low on time, at least if there are no changes to the license requirements that they have signed earlier. So it's a bold bet, but if it plays out, it would be one of those bets like AWS that everyone underestimated and you can't model out, but later on becomes a critical part of Amazon's infrastructure and entire business model.
I think what makes the Mag 7 so special is how they've found these new blockbuster ways to grow their businesses by making a wide range of bets, which we've seen most clearly with the other bets division at Alphabet. But Amazon obviously has a great track of doing something similar where they're always building these new business units that might not have been obvious to outsiders that they could even do it. Right? I saw that with Whole Foods, and then now I'm having the same reaction with Project Kuiper, where now I give Amazon the benefit of the doubt, but otherwise I would look at it and say, what are they doing with satellites? And so now maybe we should cover the physical retail stores that make up Amazon's business, just since I invoked Whole Foods again there. And I've actually been able to go to, well, not only Whole Foods, but also to the Amazon Go stores a few times. And for anyone who doesn't know, these are really cool. They're basically grocery stores that are cashierless. So you just walk in, scan your Prime code, the gate drops, you walk through, you grab your cart, and then as you put groceries in your cart, they get scanned and get added to a checkout cart on Amazon, a digital one. And as you walk out, you're automatically charged for everything, and you get a bill from Amazon. And like an hour later, you get an email for it. And I've actually never been, like I said, I've only been there a few times, but it's always worked. It's not like I've ever been mischarged for anything. So it's kind of incredible how the technology works so well. And that probably has helped to improve the margins of the grocery business.
This might be the first time where our personal experiences in terms of Amazon are fundamentally different. And I kind of hope that you would have these insights because I don't. In Germany and generally in Europe, Amazon doesn't operate any physical stores. We have no Whole Foods and we don't have Amazon Go. And even the online grocery delivery service called Amazon Fresh shut down in December 2024 after launching in Germany in 2017. So the competition in the grocery market, especially in Germany, is just too tough. And there were logistical and regulatory hurdles as well. I think the UK is an exception. I think Amazon is operating some physical stores in London that feature its just walk out technology. So while the picture looks a lot different in the US, especially since the 2017 acquisition of Whole Foods that cost Amazon about $14 billion, the picture still seems a bit mixed. The Amazon Go stores that you mentioned were basically cut in half since 2023. What did work quite well for them is licensing these just walk out technology to other retailers though. Whole Foods can probably be called a success. You also mentioned it's not just a retailer. They use it for better logistics, which basically improves their entire ecosystem once again. They still run over 500 locations, mainly in the US and Canada. Revenues come in at over 20 billion. Margins are unsurprisingly relatively slim. But it's a tough business to be in, and I don't really see why Amazon was so keen on joining the physical retail side.
I do wonder if it was meant to be a way to kind of anchor their grocery delivery strategy by having all of these stores that they could control directly and then giving them more touch points to make those deliveries from. But still, as cool as Amazon Go is, I'm not dying to go back there. And I kind of get why it doesn't seem to be a huge success. It felt like a very basic grocery store with really not the widest selection of options. And while it was kind of a novelty and pretty convenient, and it maybe did save you 5 minutes or so when checking out, ultimately that's not what matters to me the most in a grocery store. It's not necessarily how quickly can I check out. It's the selection of products. And so like I said, it just felt like a very inferior, limited version of Whole Foods. And now what I want to ask you about, which is sort of the elephant in the room, and after we've gotten the company's Q1 results, how will tariffs impact Amazon's business? Have we seen any indications that they're starting to feel that pain yet?
Yeah, there are two big topics in the latest quarterly results and basically going forward for this entire year. That's tariffs and also the CapEx spend. So maybe I'll start with the latter and then go to tariffs. One of the biggest concerns of investors has been this huge ramp up in AI CapEx. And add to that the uncertainty of tariffs and potential trade headwinds in general, and then it's easy to see why the stock has been down this quarter. The higher CapEx is already showing in the numbers. Free cash flow has bounced back from the negative territory of 2022, but it's still pretty lumpy, and because Amazon is aggressively building out new data center capacity, investing in custom AI chips, as I said, Trainium, which is their own one, and then expanding its global delivery infrastructure. Not as heavily as they did in 2022, but it's still an ongoing process. So while operating cash flow has been about $17 billion, the cash is immediately being plowed back into long-term bets. And I mean, Andy Jassy is so bullish on the outlook of those, as you can hear in one of his latest interviews with the Harvard Business Review as well. So maybe we should give that a quick listen and then we come back.
I think AI is probably, it's for sure the biggest technology transformation since the cloud. It's probably the biggest technology transformation since the internet. And so I think it's going to change every experience that we know. I would, we have a very substantial investment in the AI space right now. And I think that, I think in the early days of people getting excited about generative AI, people forgot that if you really want to pursue AI in earnest, there are 3 macro layers of that AI stack, all of which are gigantic, all of which we're investing in.
And then besides the CapEx concern, and now we're finally getting to the tariffs, they also have been a huge drag on Amazon's stock. A lot of people expected Amazon to be one of the main casualties in especially the trade escalations with China. But management addressed this in the call in this quarter, and so far they've said that the impact has been very limited and probably won't get nearly as bad as investors first feared. Maybe it's a stretch, but I even see an argument to make that in the long run, it's an advantage that Amazon might have, because all large retailers will face the same cost pressures from tariffs. Prices will go up across the board, and then Amazon becomes the company with the most scale, and that is just strength in such a market. They already offer some of the lowest prices and the broadest assortment. So if everyone is raising prices, Amazon's value proposition might actually improve in relative terms. We already talked about how they can absorb losses because of all their other businesses. And Amazon sources many goods directly from manufacturers. So while many competitors go through intermediaries or distributors who import from China and then mark up the products, in a tariff environment, that extra layer could become a real disadvantage. Amazon, by contrast, has more control over pricing pressures through vertical integration and vendor negotiation. So it might actually be an advantage for them. If anything, its pricing power, scale, and supply chain structure might let it come out of this on a stronger position than many of its retail peers.
I tend to think that a company with the resources, reach, and of course, customer traffic that Amazon has should be pretty well positioned to use its muscles to protect its business if it needs to. So what makes this conversation even more interesting is to consider how all this plays into Amazon's margin story, because when you zoom out a bit, it's not only that Amazon is holding up well throughout the investment cycle in the beginning of tariffs, we're actually seeing a company that's becoming more profitable. In 2022, operating margins dropped below 3% from what I'm seeing during the peak of the post-COVID investment cycle. And of course, it all looked pretty uncertain back then, too much infrastructure, declining retail efficiency, and all of these speculative bets that were now starting to weigh on the bottom line. But then when you fast forward to now, it's a completely different picture. In 2024, Amazon's operating margin rebounded to over 10%. And even in retail, we're also seeing signs of improvement too. The North American segment, from what I've seen, ran at over 6.5% margin in 2024, which is significantly higher than it was during the pandemic years. So could you give us some color on what's driving that margin expansion and how it plays into the broader bull case for owning Amazon?
At a high level, it's really about the business mix. AWS and advertising are growing faster than retail, and they're both incredibly profitable. AWS is running at operating margins in the high 30s, and advertising might even be higher. We don't have exact numbers because Amazon doesn't report them, but analysts estimate that they are somewhere in the 40s. Some insiders are even talking about 80%, but That seems unlikely to me. If I model it all out, and we will discuss that model later, it just seems that an 80% margin on ads would mean much higher profits than Amazon actually has. This revenue mix shift, as well as a recovery from overinvestment in 2022, caused the operating margin to recover from only 2% in 2022 to almost 12% in Q1 of this year. And while this trend looks great, I wouldn't be too surprised if we see declines in the future again, considering Amazon's history of making costly investments. Kuiper is one of those investments. Right now, all Kuiper-related costs are being fully expensed as they occur, which puts pressure on margins. But in the earnings call, management actually said that once the service becomes commercialized, they will begin capitalizing a portion of these costs. And when a company expenses the costs, it records them on the income statement, which lowers margins. And then when costs are capitalized, they are recorded as an asset on the balance sheet and only gradually expensed through depreciation. And that's why this shift should, in theory, improve margins going forward. Besides the business mix and accounting gimmicks, operating leverage is obviously a huge driver for Amazon's margin expansion as well. Investments are done today, and when the operations scale up, investments decline while profits surge.
All right. Well, we're almost 90 minutes into this thing. So why don't we get to everybody's favorite part and try to estimate the intrinsic value of Amazon?
It's about time. And Amazon is not like Adobe, a company that we have in our portfolio and that was trading cheaply on relative valuation, on traditional metrics, as well as compared to its own historic levels. And the latter is also true for Amazon today. Amazon is trading at its lowest price to operating cash flow at any point in the last decade. And I use operating cash flow here because free cash flow is just not a good proxy for Amazon's true ability to generate cash. The free cash flow is all over the place due to the high investments that we have discussed over and over again. You can argue that these investments will come to bite Amazon, but historically they have turned it into the fantastic company that it is today. And as we have discussed in our CapEx section, there are some good reasons to believe that the same will happen with the current investments as well. Even if they slightly overspend, Amazon has cash and short-term investments of $95 billion, so there's some leeway, even if you subtract $60 billion long-term debt.
I think it's safe to say Amazon is not going bankrupt. And the reason we look at Amazon today is because it is at one of the cheaper valuations it's ever traded, at least in recent history. And I don't know, this might be an interesting opportunity to invest in the company. But you know as well as I do that sometimes our intuition and looking in the rearview mirror, comparing a company to its own historical multiples can be misleading. So how about you just walk us through your model? Tell us maybe at what price you start to get interested in Amazon.
Sure. As you said, sometimes we already have an idea that a company is likely to be under or overvalued. And then when you go through the numbers, you realize whatever you thought is not actually the case. So to get a better idea of what drives Amazon returns, I broke down the entire business into their 5 core revenue and profit drivers. That's online retail, it's the third-party business, AWS, advertising, and subscriptions. And each of those has a very different growth rate and also margin profile. So just bundling them all together in a single revenue or profit number, which is what Amazon does in its reports, wouldn't help us now understanding the company. And I don't want to bore you with all the details. So if you want to take a closer look, you can find the model in our newsletter, just like every other model that we've ever created. But overall, I expect revenue growth of 9 to 10% until 2029 in my base case scenario. And AWS and advertising, the biggest drivers, growing at 16 and 17% respectively. The online retail business is obviously still the biggest chunk of revenues, but it's also the most mature and saturated business, at least if there is no further expansion fueled, for example, by Kuiper 5, 6, 7 years ahead. Then the third-party business and subscriptions are growing faster than the core business, but they have also slowed down in recent years. And I still expect high single-digit to low double-digit growth rates for these segments. But nothing stellar. And due to the little importance of the physical stores that we have discussed for the profits of Amazon, I just put them into the other pile, which is basically slow growth and lower margin.
I'm looking at your model right now, Daniel, and I'm seeing like almost $640 billion in revenue in 2024 and almost, and bear with me here, $1 trillion in revenue by 2029. And that's actually, like only an 8% revenue CAGR. So, I mean, this is a company that does a ton of business. And I knew intuitively that it was a very big top line number, but that is actually bigger than I even was first thinking. And I should also say that for anyone who does want to see all of our models in one easy place, we make that available to the members of our Intrinsic Value community. We have all the models in one place that you can just scroll through and download and access them. So that's maybe one more reason to apply for the waitlist if you're considering it. And I'll just add here to what you said, Daniel, that all does sound very reasonable. And I would say it's in line with what most analysts expect. And if you had told anyone 10 years ago that Amazon could be at this size and keep growing at double-digit rates, they would have probably laughed at you. And then when you consider the margins of these businesses as well, for AWS, we know it's in the mid to high 30s. And for advertisements, I mean, we don't know exactly, but it could even be higher than that. So there's just some really promising things about this company. And they have shown that the law of large numbers almost doesn't apply to them. They can keep growing, whether it's 200 billion, 400 or 600 billion in revenue, they're going to keep compounding.
It sounds absolutely ridiculous if you actually go through the numbers. But in my opinion, businesses like AWS and to some extent also the ad business, they're still relatively early with very much of the operating leverage still to come in the years ahead. So even when the retail business operates at a low single-digit profit margin, all the remaining businesses are driving the profits and they will likely only get better in the future. I mean, the third-party seller services, which includes fulfillment and marketplace fees, they run at 9 to 12% margin. That's definitely not a low margin business. And we've already discussed AWS, which basically reaches 40%. I mean, this quarter, AWS benefited from capacity constraints, which means that there was more demand than supply. And this imbalance improves margins, but it should normalize in the quarters ahead. And the advertising business, as we mentioned, is hard to estimate. It could be 40% margin, could be 60 to 70%, at least a couple of years out. I don't think it's unlikely they could be that high, but if I model it all out, everything far above the mid to high 30s for a profit margin on the advertising business just makes the EBIT looks astronomically high. So as a disclaimer, maybe I should say that if you model out the EBIT of each segment and then add them up to a total EBIT, as I did in my model, your EBIT will be higher than the GAAP EBIT that you see in Amazon reports, since you're leaving out investments or costs that are not directly related to any one of the segments. So this gets corrected through the EBIT to net income conversion ratio, though. So while total EBIT might look a bit higher than most estimates you will see, the EPS numbers, so the earnings per share, are more conservative again. And I probably should also add that I expect an average of 1.3% dilution, which is something that Amazon has a history of due to its stock-based compensation. And they finally start bringing that down a bit, but 1% and perhaps a bit higher than that is what you need to expect going forward with Amazon.
Where does this leave us with Amazon's intrinsic value and the price target that you find Amazon attractive at?
So after all the growth and margin assumptions that might be a bit too boring to go over all of them, I just apply a range of exit multiples on the 2029 earnings, and then I weigh them with different probabilities. And if I do that, I get an implied exit multiple of about 27.5. And then you have to go through the process of discounting that back. We always use the same rate as 8%. And then you get a fair value target somewhere in the mid 220s. And now to make this a bit more tangible, I've created a table where the estimated return based on your entry price is showing. So if you could buy Amazon stock at, I would love to do that, $120, you would get well over 20% annualized returns. And at $180 as an entry price, it would be 12 to 13%. Unfortunately, Amazon stock price just shot up while we are recording this episode, basically. And So right now, the stock is trading at $210, and then the estimated return is 9 to 10% a year, which is still okay, but I would have liked to tell you we buy the stock at $190 today.
It's a great visualization, and anyone looking at it on screen could have seen it. And I just want to emphasize it is the estimated return. So of course, nothing is guaranteed, but when you just look at the expected earnings growth and then, a reasonable exit multiple, as Daniel said, if you're below 150, you're probably getting a really good 15 to 20% return or higher. And just the way we think of it is, as that entry price increases, your expected returns looking forward decrease. And that's just the rule of investing. That's just investing 101. And at the time of recording, when we calculate that fair value by discounting Amazon's earnings back by 8% a year, it is hard to say that the stock looks extremely attractive right now. And it's basically trading right around that fair value, which wouldn't necessarily trigger us to go ahead and purchase it. And still, you don't have to sell me on owning Amazon. I mean, it's a company we should own, and it's just a question of the right price. And if we can get that, then it would be a wonderful addition to the portfolio. And they have been, and I think they will continue to be the definition of quality, right? I mean, you could say the same for all of the Mag 7 companies. But what's maybe unique about Amazon, as opposed to perhaps Alphabet, is that I don't see any imminent threats affecting their business. And you could say that about Alphabet, but also Adobe, and to a lesser extent, Airbnb, where these businesses are all under pressure in different capacities. And I just don't think Amazon has any e-commerce competitors that can disrupt its business in a way that maybe Canva could do with Adobe, or that ChatGPT could do to Google search. And Walmart is a threat here, but it's not existential. And we've already talked about how Amazon has exerted its power over Shopify. We went into that in detail last week. And then you've got these other cloud competitors, but the cloud business pie is just growing so quickly right now. It's hard to be too worried about, even if they lost a little bit of market share, if the pie is growing much more quickly than they're losing market share, they're still doing pretty well. And that's not to say Amazon is bulletproof. And of course, there's the risk of tariffs and a tariff-induced recession. And those could be really big, maybe temporary disruptions on the horizon. But there's not those competitive threats that really threaten to hurt the long-term viability of Amazon's business, which is really what we're ultimately concerned with as long-term focused investors. And I think, if anything, that tariff uncertainty has probably just created a chance to buy the stock more cheaply, or at least it did until things bounced back at the time of recording. And who knows where they will be by the time this is actually published for people to listen to. And I guess I would just say, you said 190. I would maybe even be a little more conservative. To me, it looks like if we can get any price in the low 180s or below, then I would really have the conviction to say, hey, let's make a 5% core position in Amazon. But above that, especially above $200 per share, it doesn't scream buy to me. It doesn't seem like an overwhelmingly attractive opportunity at this moment, even if it's cheaper than it relatively has been. So we need that price hedge to give us a little bit more of a margin of safety, in my opinion.
Usually, if we compare the two of us, I'm the one who's more price conscious on these stocks. But this time I would really say, if we could have gotten it, and yesterday it looked like it, we could have gotten it at 190, I would have made this, or I would have at least told you we should make this a position in our portfolio. And just as you said, I don't think we ever got this unlucky regarding the timing of recording our episode. We just saw a huge 10% hike in the stock price. And over $200, it gets a bit more difficult to make the argument for buying Amazon. I mean, it's tough to see a world where this stock, at least in my opinion, is not significantly higher in 5 years from now. Amazon is consistently outperforming every model due to its ability to build entirely new businesses that run into massive value drivers in the future ahead. And even now in my model, I don't give any value to the other bets segment. So I think there's huge potential for them outperforming all the expectations in the future. But we like to see a margin of safety, and adding Amazon at over $200 would just feel like we want to add the company, but we don't pay enough attention to price. And looking at Amazon's stock chart, this company is volatile. There's a very good chance we can get this company at prices at 180, 190, perhaps even lower at another point. So I think there's no rush in us owning Amazon. So having said all of that, let's wrap it up. It's already a long episode. And how about you give us the hints, or the audience the hints about the next episode?
Well, next week's episode, I think it's safe to say it's a bit of a change of pace. We're also covering a type of company that we haven't yet covered yet. So again, that's another hint for folks who have gone through and listened to most of our episodes. And maybe as a third hint, I'll say this is a company where two very opposite types of quite famous investors are invested in it. And one of them is one of our favorite value investors, and the other is kind of famous for their big bets on speculative technology. So you would not expect them to own the same thing, which is why it caught our attention. And I've probably already said too much though. So those are the hints. Please let us know if you have any theories on them in the comments.
I think you should keep it at that. I think those are some good hints. And I'm looking forward to you also leaving your comfort zone a little with that pitch. And now I will leave you all with a quote from Jeff Bezos that always reminds me a bit of one of Charlie Munger's most important lessons. So Bezos said, quote, "We've had 3 big ideas at Amazon that we've stuck with for 18 years. And they are the reason we are successful. Put the customer first, invent, and be patient." And having said that, I hope you all have a great day, and we will see each other next week.
Coupang has, in short, captured the hearts and wallets of nearly every household in South Korea in less than 15 years. Partly that comes from succeeding so well in adjusting the Amazon online retailer model for the customs and preferences of South Koreans. Additionally, it helps that internet usage is so common in the country, with 97% of the population using the internet compared to just 78% in China. E-commerce is a natural part of life in South Korea's densely populated cities. Where e-commerce represents about half of all retail sales in South Korea, the number is only 16% in the US. So like I said, e-commerce adoption in the country is just very, very high. Behind this vision is Bom Kim, who moved to the US as a child and later enrolled in Harvard's MBA program before deciding to chase something even more ambitious.